Hey there, I'm Joshua Johnson. It's great to be with you on this Thursday, March 10th. Here is some of what we're talking about tonight. Russian forces are closing in on Ukraine's capital, Kyiv. Apparently, they're just a few miles away. Russia is demanding a full surrender, but Ukraine's foreign minister rejected that.
Ukraine is strong. Ukraine is fighting. Ukraine made Russian initial plans fail. We will not surrender.
How might Ukraine handle stronger Russian attacks? A former advisor to President Zelenskyy joins us live. Russian forces control 2 of Ukraine's nuclear power plants. We'll have an update and consider if the plant workers can be kept safe. Plus, millions of American children could soon lose their free school lunches. We'll explain why. And baseball is not back, but it's close. You'll see when the major leagues might play ball under a new deal to end the lockout. We have entered week 3 of Russia's assault on Ukraine. Russian forces are getting closer to Kyiv, and the U.S. Defense Assessment says they're within 10 miles of the city center. Other Ukrainian cities continue to suffer Russian airstrikes. The southern port city of Mariupol has been hit especially hard, including today. Yesterday, Russian airstrikes hit a hospital there. Outrage over that attack grew today. Ukrainian officials say the attack killed at least 3 people, including a child. We'll discuss that shortly with a Ukrainian member of parliament. Meanwhile, Ukraine is doing what it can to establish humanitarian corridors and evacuate civilians. Temporary ceasefires are holding in some cities. Russian attacks are frustrating efforts elsewhere. These ceasefire negotiations were the backdrop for another round of talks today. Foreign ministers from both sides met in Turkey. It was the first time since this conflict began that such high-ranking officials sat down to talk, but there were no breakthroughs. Meanwhile, in Washington, senators told intelligence officials about their concerns that Russia might attack Ukraine with chemical weapons. CIA Director William Burns says he takes that very seriously.
Whether it's the potential for a use of chemical weapons, either as a false flag operation or against Ukrainians. This is something, as all of you know very well, is very much a part of Russia's playbook. They've used those weapons against their own citizens. They've at least encouraged the use in Syria and elsewhere.
Let's begin tonight in Lviv with NBC's Cal Perry joining us live. Cal, what is the status right now of these humanitarian corridors, if any of them have been established yet?
So 83,000 people have made it out of the northern city of Sumy in the past few days. That seems to be the only one that's really functioning. As you said, the peace talks today in Turkey, really a failure with one minor exception, which is the chief head of the IAEA was actually there. And they seem to have agreed to open up a humanitarian corridor to Chernobyl, notably not to get people out or to get people in, but to get engineers to the site to try to reconnect it up to power. Those, like I said, 83,000 civilians are the only ones to get out of that northern area in Mariupol. No one has been able to get in or out for 6 days. The deputy prime minister is saying they can't even get food or water to some of these cities, Joshua, let alone get people out, because these cities are under that constant, at least indiscriminate bombing at the very least, or directly targeting civilians by Russian forces, Joshua.
Yeah, Cal, you kind of got at my next question, which is even if you can establish these corridors when people are able to get out of wherever they are, there's also the matter of what they find on the other end of the corridor, of how much of a humanitarian presence is there to receive them, the level of supplies that are there. It sounds like there is a compounding array of challenges involved in getting people out of harm's way.
Yeah, and add to that, there's a complete lack of trust on behalf of civilians to even trust that they're going to be able to safely pass from these corridors, because Russian forces are targeting and have in the past actually targeted these quote-unquote corridors. Add to that, Doctors Without Borders and the Red Cross are almost begging for a ceasefire so that they can get into these cities. I think, we forget sometimes that the only people who've even been able to leave are people who can physically run from the fighting and physically flee from these cities. There are an unknown number of folks, tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of folks stuck in these areas that just can't leave because they're physically unable to leave, or they have elderly relatives who can't leave. There's individual circumstances don't allow them to, and we've yet to see that. We're entering week 3 of this war, and we've yet to see, for example, a Red Cross convoy make it into one of these urban areas.
Cal, describe a little bit more of what you're seeing where you are. Is the flow of people as steady as it has been, both towards the border from Ukraine to Poland and also from Poland and other countries to try and receive them?
It is. It's as steady as it has been. I think this city has now filled up, and we heard this from the mayor. It's filled to the point where it can take the amount of people that it has, and you're starting to see more and more of these encampments, for example, at the train station where people are now sleeping outside. In Poland, there's more of these encampments where, again, people are sleeping outside, and it's vitally important that we remind folks it is freezing cold here. There is a cold snap that has hit this entire part of Europe, and you have people that are exposed to these conditions. It's all the much worse, of course, in these places that are seeing, combat and are seeing this shelling. But for refugees, for internally displaced people, it's a disintegrating situation because people are running out of room. They're running out of places to stay. This city is still functioning in some ways. There are still restaurants that are open that have food, but it's a question of how long will that last. 2 days ago, we had kind of our first ominous moment really here where the power went out across the city. That's a major concern. When you look at these power plants and the Russians occupying some of these sites, the concern is they're going to flip the power off. People don't have heat, and that's going to only increase that humanitarian crisis.
I do want to note, by the way, that Poland's President Andrzej Duda tweeted earlier this evening about the prospect, as he puts it, and this is coming from his official Twitter account, of another attempt being made to evacuate citizens from Mariupol, which is in southeastern Ukraine. He writes that Russian troops are still not ready to storm Kyiv. They are trying to break the defenders by bombing residential buildings and hospitals. Tomorrow, another attempt will be made to evacuate citizens from Mariupol. Russians are shelling nonstop. God save Ukraine. That's from the verified Twitter account of Andrzej Duda, who is the president of Poland. Cal, before I have to let you go, what is your sense of the international response from Russia, Ukraine, Poland, other nations, to try to come to some sort of diplomatic progress on this? Poland's president apparently believes that there is an additional evacuation attempt coming for Mariupol tomorrow. The meeting between the two foreign ministers today from Ukraine and Russia bore no fruit. So what's the next step?
Yeah, I mean, what we heard from the Ukrainian foreign minister after that meeting was fairly depressing, because it was his takeaway, as he said to the media, that his counterpart, Foreign Minister Lavrov of Russia, really did not have the authority to negotiate. This is what he said to the media, that he felt like that only Vladimir Putin was the one who could negotiate, had the power to negotiate. And you have this considerable concern on behalf of Ukrainian officials that this is a tactic Russia is using to regroup. We've heard this time and time again, that they're concerned that when they sit down and they negotiate and they have these conversations, it's just a way for Russia to militarily buy themselves time. And that's their theory on why these corridors aren't opening up. It's also worth noting they have tried to evacuate civilians from Mariupol via the sea as well, and there are Russian ships in those waters. So it is not happening via land or sea, which doesn't give anyone here a great deal of optimism for the people who have now, as I said, been under that shelling and under those conditions almost for a week, Joshua.
All right, thank you, Cal. Please do stay safe as best you can. That's NBC's Cal Perry starting us off tonight from the western Ukrainian city of Lviv. Now, throughout this war, Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelenskyy has released video messages. He talks directly to his citizens, to world leaders, to Vladimir Putin, and to the people of Russia. President Zelenskyy has remained in Kyiv despite world leaders urging him not to stay. Instead, he has posted videos from the city's streets. Friendly governments are also hearing from him directly. This week, the president spoke to the UK Parliament. He plans to speak with Canada's Parliament this month. Now, Volodymyr Zelenskyy is no stranger to the camera. He was an actor before he was president. Is that what makes his messaging so effective? Or is there more to it? Let's discuss that with Igor Novikov, a former advisor to President Zelenskyy. Mr. Novikov, welcome to the program. Good to have you with us.
Thanks for having me. Hi.
Can I just start with your situation now in terms of how things are going where you are? I don't want to force you to say too much about your location for your own sake and for your safety's sake, but how are things where you are as you see it?
Well, I'm in Kyiv. I'm in the quieter part of Kyiv at the moment. I mean, it changes dramatically from day to day, but, so far it's been relatively quiet tonight. But that's what makes the situation more dangerous at the moment because, the Russians are regrouping and we're worried that, we're in for a second wave of attacks or potential use of some non-conventional weapons. And to explain that point, I need to explain to you what Kyiv is like. I mean, it's a huge city. We've heard Mayor Klitschko say that half the population have left, so that leaves at least 1.5 to 2 million people still in the city. There's lots of old residential buildings. There's lots of weapons and munition, and the city is a fortress. So anyone who is familiar with military tactics knows that it's impossible to take Kyiv with the force that Russia has at the moment on the ground in Ukraine, even if they gave up on everything else. So that kind of makes us think whether, Kyiv is a bluff, Kyiv is just a stupid operation and they don't know what they're doing, or, they're going to use something that would tip the scales to their advantage. So we don't know, but we're entering a very dangerous and grim period.
With regards to how President Zelenskyy has been handling this war so far, I'd love your assessment of it. If this is the Volodymyr Zelenskyy you knew before all hell broke loose in Ukraine.
It is. And, as I keep saying, he's a different kind of politician. He's not a politician. So he's an ordinary guy. And, Ukraine needed its John Wick. It's his John McClane. And he's exactly that. He's a symbol of our resistance. And the very fact that he stayed in Kyiv got the people motivated enough to keep fighting, keep resisting. I think any other president would have left in his situation.
Talk about how Ukrainians have responded to Russian forces. Granted, the latest assessment we have today is that about 95% of Russia's military that it has amassed around Ukraine still hasn't been deployed yet. So there is a tremendous Russian armament that could yet enter Ukraine if Vladimir Putin chose to deploy. They could also be there just as a saber to rattle, so we don't really know what's going to happen there. But I think a lot of the world's been very taken by the way Ukrainians have responded to this. Is this something that Ukraine has been preparing for since the crisis in Crimea? Is this something that's more recent? Where does this come from?
Well, I think Crimea caught us off guard. So, as a European freedom-loving nation, nobody expected in Ukraine that Russia would just annex territory. That was, really strange to live through. After that, we realized that, anything is possible with Russia. And that's one of the things that you need to explain to the American audience. I mean, I keep hearing those arguments that, you need to tread carefully because you're going to provoke Putin and, you can cause a major conflict with him. Look, Putin is the man who's created, at least within Russia, an alternate reality that doesn't have anything to do with real life. So it's just an episode of Black Mirror. And, any reason of false flag or pretext with a man like that is a non sequitur. Even the smallest sanctions is enough for him to declare war on you should he decide to do that. So that's as far as Russia is concerned. Ukrainians are resisting because, look, we have been, united as a nation since 2014, since we had a revolution of dignity, had violence used against us for the first time by the Russians and, the Russian influence. And, we've been ready for that, as ready as one can be for 8 years now. So, I mean, we're going to give it everything that we have. And I think at the moment, as things stand, we stand a really good chance. But, we'll have to wait and see what Putin throws at us because, it's difficult to predict. I mean, we're worried about chemical weapons, obviously.
Yeah, I mean, that concern has come up, the possibility of chemical weapons that was mentioned, that came up here in Washington as well, or in Washington as well. Before I have to let you go, I'd love to get your reaction on what happens now. We mentioned that Russia's foreign minister met with Ukraine's foreign minister Sergei Lavrov and Dmytro Kuleba met today. That did not yield much progress on negotiations, particularly because Russia has asked Ukraine to surrender, and the foreign minister told them to go pound sand. That was never going to happen. Here is a little bit more of what Ukraine's foreign minister said, and then I would love to get your sense of where things go from here. Watch.
Sure. Russia is not in a position at this point to establish a ceasefire. They seek a surrender from Ukraine, but this is not what they are going to get. Ukraine is strong, Ukraine is fighting, Ukraine made Russian initial plans fail. We are ready to seek balanced diplomatic solutions to put an end to this war, but we will not surrender.
Before we have to move on, what do you think breaks this logjam? I know a lot of Ukrainians, including President Zelenskyy, have been asking for a no-fly zone. NATO allies have said pretty much steadfastly that's not going to happen. So is that the only thing that breaks this logjam, or is there another way?
Well, look, what's the end game for Putin? I mean, that's a question that we have to ask. I mean, at the moment, everyone is trying to concentrate on an off-ramp. I think Putin wants, Ukraine as, potential territory to go further. Therefore, we're seeing tactics to try and expel civilians and break resistance and kind of grab the territory. Therefore, he wouldn't want any off-ramps. He'd want his end game, one way or the other. And I think that's where we had it. So, and look, I'm not a huge believer in diplomacy with Russia without any major military victories. So when we're winning beyond, reasonable doubt, that's where there'll be a chance of an off-ramp. At the moment, I think, diplomacy with Russia is just like an episode of Dr. Carl. I mean, sorry for the analogy.
Mr. Igor Novikov, I understand. I appreciate you making time to talk to us. Stay safe as best you can, and thank you very much.
Thank you.
Still to come, Russia's attack knocked the Chernobyl nuclear plant off the power grid. We'll ask a nuclear expert whether Chernobyl could become another Chernobyl. We're glad you're with us. For Now Tonight from NBC News. We were just talking about the threat of Russia using chemical weapons in Ukraine. British Prime Minister Boris Johnson expressed his concerns about that to our partners at Sky News.
You're hearing about chemical weapons. This is straight out of their playbook. They start saying that there are chemical weapons that have been stored by their opponents or by the Americans, and so when they themselves deploy chemical weapons, as I fear they may, they have a sort of a Maskirovka, a fake story ready to go. And you've seen it in Syria. You saw it even in the UK when.
This is what you expect next, then?
Look, I just note that is what they're already doing. It is a cynical, barbaric government, I'm afraid.
On Sky News last night, he said he thinks millions of people could die. Do you think millions of people could die in this conflict?
I think that it depends on Putin, and it's up to him and to him alone, and that everybody can see that things aren't progressing in the way that he hoped.
Prime Minister,
and his best bet, I think, is to withdraw, to cease the violence, and to allow a peaceful negotiation to begin.
Your Foreign Secretary said it could last a decade. Do you agree with that?
I think that again, that depends on Putin. But what I certainly think is that the Ukrainians themselves and the will to resist in Ukraine will never be extinguished.
I get that, but how long is it going to go on for?
You heard that from Vladimir Zelenskyy himself.
For the long haul.
I think that
Months,
my own view is that Vladimir Putin can either choose to accept that he's made a catastrophic mistake now, or accept that he's made a catastrophic mistake a bit later on.
But when?
And that's the difference between the two options he faces.
But how long?
That is, I'm afraid, up to the Kremlin. I wish Beth, I wish that I could tell you how long it will be. I think that he has said that he wants to give the military operations till the end of this month. You've heard what Putin's own narrative is. I myself don't believe, and I don't think most people looking at the situation believe. I don't think that he can conquer Ukraine. I think what needs to happen, first of all, is that Putin needs to understand that he's made a catastrophic miscalculation, and he needs to withdraw. He needs to stop killing innocent people in Ukraine. I then think that there is certainly space for a conversation about the future, but it's got to be in that context, and it's got to be something that the people of Ukraine and the Ukrainian government actively want, Beth. And I think this is the crucial thing. I don't think that you can have a conversation about Ukraine without Ukraine.
That's British Prime Minister Boris Johnson speaking to Sky News political editor Beth Rigby. What's happening now at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant in northern Ukraine? Unfortunately, the Ukrainian government says it has lost communication with it. That's according to the International Atomic Energy Agency. Russia's defense ministry recently said that it would let Ukrainian technicians restore power to the site. Chernobyl was the site of the world's largest nuclear disaster back in 1986. No wonder Ukrainian officials are alarmed about a power outage. U.S. and IAEA officials say there's no risk at the moment, but the plant is now under Russian control. Let's get some context now from Andy Weber, a senior fellow at the Council on Strategic Risks. He served in the Obama administration as an Assistant Secretary of Defense for nuclear, chemical, and biological defense programs. Mr. Weber, welcome to the program.
Thank you.
First of all, could you just explain what it means for a nuclear plant to be disconnected from the power grid? I think it might sound a little confusing to some people because a nuclear plant generates power, but it's also connected to external power. Explain that.
Right. So a nuclear power plant has systems for cooling, fire control, etc., operated with electricity. And if they're disconnected from the grid, then they lose all that. They do have backup generators, diesel generators, which without refueling last for about 48 hours. So those kick on, but we're coming up to that timeline. The other issue is that the IAEA has remote monitoring systems, cameras, and those have also been cut off. So we're operating blind in terms of what's going on today at the Chernobyl site.
Explain about those communication and monitoring systems at the plant. What kinds of things do they communicate to the outside world? I presume it's just to monitor everything that's going on there at the plant, right?
Yes, so the IAEA has continuous monitoring primarily to prevent the diversion of fuel into weapons programs, to ensure that the inventory control systems are in place. So those have been lost. The UN IAEA organization has no insight. I know the Director General is trying to meet with Russian officials tonight to gain access to the facility and to assure that those cameras and other remote sensing systems are reactivated.
Could you just level set for us a little bit? I think it really freaked a lot of people out when we heard that the Russians had attacked the area of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant at the beginning of this war a few weeks ago, and now concerns about the plant in Chernobyl, also further southeast of there in Zaporizhia, which was attacked basically a week ago today. All of this is very worrisome. Level set for us. Are we talking about another Chernobyl at Chernobyl, or is this not necessarily that dire a situation?
Well, the nuclear reactors at Chernobyl, the last of them was actually shut off in 2000. So we're not talking about another Chernobyl at Chernobyl. However, you mentioned the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant, which is operational. And if those cooling systems are lost for an extended period of time, we could have another meltdown like a Chernobyl or a Fukushima. So the Russians have been attacking these facilities, taking the personnel needed to operate them safely, essentially as hostages at gunpoint. They're controlling these facilities. And it's a terrible situation They haven't been able to go home. Some of them need medication, and it's just a brutal, ruthless, and reckless move by the Russian military and President Putin to attack these nuclear facilities, of which there are quite a few others in Ukraine.
I want to make sure I heard you correctly, because so often in war we deal in a lot of hyperbole, and I just want to make sure I heard you right. It sounds like you're saying that Chernobyl itself, because of the state of that plant, is not in danger of having another Chernobyl-like meltdown like what happened in '86. But the Zaporizhzhia plant, because it's still active, because it's still turned on, could have a meltdown. That is not outside the realm of possibility. Did I hear you right?
Yes, that's exactly right, Joshua, because it's an operational reactor. And if the cooling systems are lost for an extended period of time, indeed, it could have a meltdown.
How long is an extended period of time?
Well, that really depends on the status. It takes a while to shut down a reactor safely. What we don't know is what are the Russian intentions. I mean, for example, the Zaporizhzhia reactor provides 25% of Ukraine's electricity. There are actually 6 reactors at the site. If the Russian intent is to cut off electricity to cities like Kyiv and the other cities around the country, that could be devastating and add to the humanitarian crisis, but also increase the risk that they would not be shut down safely.
Let me ask you about where this goes from here. If memory serves, there are 15 reactors in Ukraine at 4 sites, active sites, including Zaporizhzhia, which was attacked last week. We heard today from the Director General of the International Atomic Energy Agency, Rafael Grossi. He spoke today in Vienna. Here's part of what he said.
One important thing is that Ukraine and the Russian Federation want to work with us. They agree to work with us, and they are prepared to work with us. Perhaps the gravity of my tone has to do with the gravity of the situation, because it's a very dire situation, and we need to move fast. And I am aware of the responsibility we have and the expectations that there are.
Before I let you go, Mr. Weber, how optimistic are you that both sides, that everyone involved, can come to kind of agreement to prevent a nuclear power plant disaster in Ukraine? I would hope that we're a little optimistic because Zaporizhzhia is not terribly far away from the contested regions that were attacked in 2014, but maybe I'm being too optimistic here. How do you see it?
I'm cautiously optimistic as long as the Ukrainian staff remain in place and continue to operate the cooling systems safely at those reactors. But you can hear the frustration in Director General Rafael Grossi's voice that he's not getting fast, urgent cooperation from the Russian side. And until the Russian military leaves Ukraine, this is going to continue to be a high-risk situation.
Andy Weber, I appreciate you putting some context around all of this for us tonight. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Joshua.
Up next, we'll have more on the situation in Ukraine and on some of tonight's other top stories. A deal is on the table to bring back baseball. We'll have details and a possible date for opening day. Plus, inflation is still on the rise. It just hit a 40-year high. And some school lunch programs are in jeopardy. What could that mean for children across the U.S.? Tonight's headlines begin with baseball. The Major League lockout is over. After nearly 100 days of negotiations, owners and the Players Union have agreed on a labor contract. The deal calls for a full season of 162 games. Tonight, team owners voted to ratify the deal. A statement from the union praised the new deal, including better pay. But the contract is only closed once both sides formally ratify it. If that happens, opening day would be on April 7th. Players will report to spring training this Sunday. The contract also brings some rule changes. The designated hitter finally comes to the National League, finally, and the postseason will expand from 10 teams to 12. Inflation is hitting many Americans hard these days, and new numbers from the Labor Department today confirm what we already felt. Inflation in February rose nearly 8% from last year. That is a 40-year high. Now, from this January to this February, it was up 0.8% overall. Food prices rose 1% that month. Gas and fuel oil, as you can see, were up considerably more than that. A statement from President Biden blames rising energy prices on Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The president added that the job market is recovering, unemployment claims remain low, and the unemployment insurance rate is at its lowest point in more than 50 years. For the first time ever, victims of the opioid crisis formally confronted the Sackler family. The Sacklers own Purdue Pharma. That's the company that makes OxyContin. And that drug was involved in hundreds of thousands of overdoses across America. Today's virtual hearing was the only opportunity during this lengthy legal battle for victims to directly address the Sacklers. 3 members of the family sat through roughly 2 hours of testimony. Victims described surviving addiction and losing loved ones. Ryan Hampton survived opioid addiction himself. Mr. Hampton said in part, quote, "I want to tell you today that you will be judged by greater powers than this justice system and this bankruptcy court. No matter how much money you pay in a settlement or how many millions your family has spent on their reputation, the legacy of the Sackler family can never be changed. You will be remembered as what you are, for destroying generations of promise," unquote. The Sacklers spoke briefly, only to confirm their presence. They did not respond to the testimony. The family will pay roughly $6 billion in exchange for immunity from future opioid lawsuits. Millions of school children could soon be without access to breakfast or lunch. A $1.5 trillion spending bill that was just passed by the U.S. House left out funding for this program. The bill would allocate money to fund the government through September. It excluded $11 billion worth of child nutrition waivers. These were a hallmark of the Families First Coronavirus Response Act. That's a COVID-19 relief package passed in March 2020. The act put school meals largely under the authority of the USDA. Then it provided schools with waivers that let them serve free and reduced price meals to nearly every student, regardless of their family's income. According to a USDA official, 90% of schools have been using a waiver to serve free meals to their students. However, the USDA's authority ends on June 30th, and the additional 10 million students receiving free meals at school each day will no longer be eligible. Joining us now is Laura Riley. She covers the business of food for the Washington Post. Ms. Riley, first of all, can you just explain a little bit more about how these waivers work?
Well, so there are really 3 things that are going away. So there's money. So school lunch reimbursement will go from about $4.50 per lunch to under $3, $2.91 per lunch. So that impacts every school, every district around the country. But in addition to that, it's about flexibility. So because Republican legislators have said, hey, the pandemic is nearly over, we shouldn't be funding this pandemic relief. This is going away. However, all of these schools have had supply chain problems. I spent a couple days in Burke County, Georgia, watching as they pivot, as trucks show up half full, and they have to figure out something to do. So some of these waivers are about giving schools flexibility in what they serve, and not just what they serve, but where they serve it. This will take away the opportunity for meals to be served in the classroom, were there to be another variant that came down the pike. So it really does take a lot of tools out of the toolbox from school districts.
You mentioned that Republican lawmakers pushed back against this funding. Explain a little bit more of the politics behind why this money was taken out.
Well, I think that there are a lot of valid questions about how all of the COVID relief money got spent. We've seen some fraud. We've seen some unfortunate profiteering go on. There's some interesting cases coming out that people took advantage of the situation. So I think a lot of Republicans are saying, before we spend more money on the pandemic, as these Omicron numbers are really plummeting, let's take a pause and let's not just, throw new money into this. But I will tell you that a lot of school districts they've spent the past 2 years giving everybody meals that showed up, right? You show up, you're hungry, you get a meal. They have not asked kids to prove their parents' low income eligibility for 2 years. So starting June 30th, all of a sudden a kid will show up waiting to get a meal, and they'll be told, oh, I'm sorry, you need to fill out a form, or have your parent come and fill out a form to say that they are eligible for free or reduced price lunch. And no one has the infrastructure or the labor, frankly, to make that happen.
Talk about the impact of these waivers now. I mean, they started early in the pandemic when a lot of schools were closing, and there was a deep concern that kids who rely on schools for free and reduced breakfast and lunch would basically go hungry. Now we've got schools reopening, schools are beginning to lift some of their mask mandates even. What does the need look like now compared to what it was then?
Joshua, it's the most remarkable thing. In some ways, the need is greater now, or the pressures on the school districts are greater now. They have incredible supply chain problems and fuel price problems and transportation. I mean, they're just not truckers available. This year, a lot of the school districts found that their contracts with their food distributors, U.S. Foods or Cisco, went away, and so they had to find new distributors across the board. School districts are really finding that they have to have, some of them are serving breakfast for lunch because they don't have, the nuggets that they ordered. So they really do need the flexibility. And, I talked to a district in Utah, in Salt Lake City, and they said, we can't get labor right now because the wages just went up across the board in retail to $15 an hour. And our max is $13.50. We cannot get people in the door. So, there are ongoing problems that even as COVID lifts, even as mask mandates go away, even as all students are back in the classroom, schools are still facing these significant problems.
We asked for your thoughts on this free school meal program potentially going away. And just to be clear, this is part of a funding bill that has worked its way through Congress. It hasn't been signed into law yet, so it's not done yet, but it is part of a bill that was reached as part of a bipartisan negotiation, so it seems likely. But we did get a few of your responses about this. Ellen tweeted, yes, breakfast and lunch and a snack if they need it, and partner with food banks for weekend food backpacks if they need that. No more hungry kids. And Susie tweeted, we provide breakfast and lunch. Many students are sent home with bags stuffed with food through the Bags of Hope program at my Title I school. It's still happening. Laura Riley of the Washington Post, I appreciate you explaining this to us. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Up next, we will shift back to Ukraine. The foreign policy advisor to Ukraine's deputy prime minister joins us before we go. Ukraine's deputy prime minister is calling the city of Mariupol a humanitarian catastrophe. Today, she said it is impossible to evacuate people. The city's been without electricity or water or heat or food or medical supplies for days. According to AccuWeather, today's high in Mariupol was about 30 degrees Fahrenheit. It felt closer to 10 degrees. Yesterday, a Russian attack hit a maternity and children's hospital. In response, European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen tweeted, quote, the bombing of the Mariupol maternity hospital is inhumane, cruel, and tragic. I am convinced that this can be a war crime. We need a full investigation, unquote. Russia claims that it did not play a part in the hospital attack. It says the attack was staged to encourage anti-Russian sentiment in the West. One thing is sure, the destruction is mounting. Check out these before and after photos. These were grocery stores and shopping malls. Now they're completely destroyed. Joining us now is Svetlana Zelenskyy, a former member of Ukraine's parliament. Today, she's a foreign policy advisor to Ukraine's deputy prime minister on European integration and an advisor to the CEO of Naftogaz Group, a Ukrainian state-owned energy company. Ms. Zelenskyy, welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me.
Could we start with the situation in Mariupol, first of all? Ukraine's deputy prime minister has referred to it as a humanitarian catastrophe in terms of the difficulty, if not impossibility, of evacuating civilians from there. How do you see the situation on the ground there, and what do you think might make the biggest difference?
Indeed, the situation in Mariupol is Putin's military strategy of the scorched earth. We have already 71 kids who have been killed. In Mariupol, there are 50,000 children that are being held as hostages without water, proper warmth, proper heating. 300,000 people are sitting there in a situation, unhuman, basically, situation. And, I think that Mariupol particularly made Putin mad. Why? Because Mariupol is a Russian-speaking language city. And you know very well that Putin has this narrative that he is protecting the Russian-speaking population territories. So I want to say this, that Mariupol is the city that in Russian-speaking, in Russian language, curses Russia and curses Putin. Putin will be hated forever on this land. The situation is that Mariupol the civilian population cannot leave the city already for more than 7 days. There are no food supply, water supply, and the cynicism is that Putin created so-called green corridors for people to be evacuated to Belarus or to Russia, to the territories of the aggressor, which is, of course, unaccepted.
I wonder how you see the fight there as opposed to the fight in other parts of Ukraine. A senior defense official tells NBC News that Russian forces are, in some axes, as close as 10 miles away from reaching the Kyiv city center. How central is the capital compared to some of these other cities?
Well, if you look at the strategy, if you look on the map of Ukraine, Putin started to attack on the sea, on the land, from the air, and there are several key cities that Putin is trying to seize. Kyiv is, without a doubt, is the major city, right, where the government is, the capital is. So the biggest forces are surrounded, accumulated around Kyiv. Mariupol is in the south and is the closest to Crimea, is the closest to Donetsk, where Russian troops have been standing, have been accumulated already for years, of course. And in Mariupol, if you look at what they are doing, for example, yesterday they attacked maternity hospital. Many schools, many hospitals have severely damaged in Mariupol. The so-called emergency department hospital also damaged in Mariupol. So whoever needs serious surgery cannot receive it. So they go after civilians. They attack civilian infrastructure and civilians as a blackmail of the government to surrender.
Let me ask you about how some of the world's biggest companies are responding to all of this. There is a growing list of companies that has decided to cut ties with Russia and stop doing business there, some of which are scrolling on the screen there. As we mentioned, you were an advisor to the CEO of the Ukrainian state-owned energy company Naftogaz. The U.S. has banned Russia's oil imports. The U.K. plans to phase them out over the course of the year. How much of the response to this war do you think could be more economic than military? What's the balance?
Less business in Russia, less money for this bloody war. I think this is the principle that we have to be mind of. And, it's not only the solidarity. We, of course, grateful to those businesses that withdrew themselves from Russia. But it's not only the solidarity. Actually, the guiding principles of the United Nations is to include human rights, the human rights in business activity. So if you have any doubts, if you have any concerns that it will finance, it will nourish this bloody war, then business have to react. In my mind, there are three key principles of the support of Ukraine at this moment. It's military support, it's economic sanctions, and it's humanitarian aid. These are the three things that, that we expect from the international community and that will help to stop this war.
With regards to the international community, we've gotten a message from one of our viewers that I'd love you to react to. Sandra wrote, Zelenskyy, President Vladimir Zelenskyy, too, is correct in his observation. The world has let Ukraine down. We all see it. Needs must be met to save Ukraine. Ukraine is vanishing before our eyes. Ukraine belongs in NATO and EU, the European Union. Of course, Vladimir Putin has said that one of his red lines is Ukraine joining NATO, and Ukraine has petitioned to join the European Union. Of course, if Ukraine was a NATO member, then this would have a very different complexion, this war, if it happened at all, because that would mean that Russia was picking on every other NATO member, including the United States. There's been a lot of concern about what that would mean if NATO got involved in this war, that it could escalate very, very quickly. What would you say to people in terms of the future of Ukraine's involvement in groups like NATO, like the European Union, and how that would affect all of this?
You know, in 1994, Ukraine voluntarily gave up on our nuclear weapon, one of the biggest nuclear arsenal in the world at that time. And Russia, but together with US, Ukraine, UK, and France, were the guarantors of the security in Ukraine after Ukraine gave up on the nuclear weapon. It was fixed in the Budapest Memorandum. Unfortunately, there are no legal obligations to protect Ukraine if invasion happens, but in my mind there is of course moral responsibility in front of Ukraine. Moreover, in 2008, Ukraine asked to be granted NATO membership action plan. Unfortunately, at that point we were refused based on the reason on the ground that it would escalate Russia. It didn't just escalate Russia, right? We received full-fledged wars, first in Georgia and then in Ukraine. And when Russia invaded Ukraine, attacked Ukraine, NATO says, sorry, we're not going to help you because you're not member of NATO. So, of course, I see it that the world today has to react based on the moral ground. And, you know, U.S. had military operations in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in Somalia. And I want to ask U.S. government, is it less democracy in Ukraine that has to be protected? Are there less red lines that have been crossed by Putin? Are we less partners for NATO today than other countries that US were involved in? You know, Putin wants to make Syria out of Ukraine, and 40 million nation will never forgive Putin. Will hate him forever, but we will also not forget the partners don't stop it when they can stop it, you know, because one of the things that really makes me confused, you know, that we allow Putin to interpret the reality for us. So Putin says today, if US or other NATO members will create this no-fly zone, we will consider it as the World War III, right? But my point is that actually we ask US and we ask other partners not to attack Russia on their territory, but to help us to protect ourselves on our territory. So yes, my point is that today, here in Ukraine, you protect not only Ukraine, but you protect democracy and humanness. And I think that US leadership will not have a right to talk about fight for democracy if you are not here with us to protect this democracy.
Svetlana Zalishchuk, I appreciate you making time to speak with us tonight. Do stay safe as best you can, and thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
The overwhelming majority of refugees leaving Ukraine are women and children. Most men are banned from leaving and are staying behind to fight. More than 2 million have crossed the border into places like Poland, Hungary, Slovakia, Moldova, and Romania. But many Ukrainians are choosing to stay home. Now, when it comes to making that decision, humanitarian workers tell us that every family is different.
2 million women and children, mainly, crossing the border in just 2 weeks. The numbers could go up to somewhere between 7 and 10 million. We haven't seen such a displacement since the times of the Second World War.
Все бомблять. Там полно всяких игрушек, которые подсовывают бомби. В погребі сиділи, багато бомбили, бахкало.
All these children, they had a normal life 2 weeks ago. They were going to school, they had a house, they had a family, they have friends. All these women that are having deliveries in the basements of buildings, in makeshift shelters, in metro stations, under the bombs with the missiles flying over their heads. All these women are also casualties of war.
Where are you going? Where will you go? Do you have a place to sleep?
Poland.
Your husband, where is he?
Ukraine.
Mit lehet, mikor az egész életünk munkája?
Igen, nem találtam.
Az életünk munkája, mindent ott kell hagyni, de csak oda is lejössz az udvarról. Bele lehet abba gondolni, hogy mit lehet érezni.
We don't have electricity. We don't have anything to eat. We don't have medicine. We've got nothing.
The humanitarian corridor is a safe passage. Without corridors, the delivery of any humanitarian relief is compromised. We've seen it over and over and over. In the case of Mariupol is a clear example of a corridor that was agreed upon and yet was not respected. I have the feeling, I have to confess, that we're falling short. We need to do more.
I didn't want to change my country, to leave my country, because we have a happy family, happy life. And now our family is separated, and also I hope that everything will be okay, but I don't know.
We know these stories are extremely difficult to watch sometimes, but we appreciate you sticking with us through them. And we thank you for making time for us tonight and every night. Come on back tomorrow if you would. We'll be speaking to a former Russian foreign minister. We would love your questions and stories, so please get in touch. We're at NBC Now Tonight on Twitter, TikTok, Facebook, and Instagram. If you like, you can leave us a voicemail, 888-575-2NBC. That's 888-575-2622. Or you can email us nowtonight@nbcnews.com. We look forward to your questions and stories, but until we meet again, I'm Joshua Johnson. For all of us at NBC News, including our correspondents in harm's way tonight, thank you for watching, and we'll see you tomorrow. Good night.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.